July 1944. Normandy. German General Fritz Bayerlein stood in the shattered remains of his command post, staring across a battlefield that barely resembled the French countryside. What had once been hedgerows and quiet farmland now looked like the surface of the moon-churned earth. Smoking craters and the twisted wreckage of vehicles scattered in every direction. Only hours earlier, waves of American bombers had roared overhead, unleashing one of the most devastating air attacks of the Normandy campaign. Entire positions had simply vanished. Tanks were flipped like toys. Communications were gone. Units were disoriented and cut off, but the destruction itself wasn't what truly unsettled WWII. German forces had endured heavy bombardments before, in Poland, in Russia, and in North Africa. Massive firepower was nothing new to the Wehrmacht. What worried him was what usually followed, because after years of fighting the British across multiple theaters, German commanders believed they understood how the Western Allies operated. British offensives were typically deliberate and methodical. They struck hard, but in ways that experienced German officers had learned to anticipate and counter. Normandy, however, was beginning to tell a very different story. The Americans were not behaving according to the familiar pattern. Their attacks felt faster, less predictable, more relentless, and behind every breakthrough seemed to stand an industrial machine capable of replacing losses. Almost overnight, for the first time in the West, many German commanders sensed that their proven defensive methods might no longer be enough. What they were facing in Normandy was not just another Allied offensive. It was a new kind of armored warfare, and it would help shatter the German army in France. This is the story of why German commanders came to fear American armor even more than the British. By the summer of 1944, German officers on the Western Front were not facing an unknown opponent. Many of them had spent years fighting British forces across multiple theaters of the war, and they believed they had learned the British way of battle, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy. The British Army had developed a very recognizable style of warfare, one shaped by caution, professionalism, and careful planning. It was careful, methodical, deliberate. British offensives rarely relied on sudden gambles. Instead, they were built step by step, with overwhelming firepower carefully coordinated before any major ground movement began. A typical British attack followed a rhythm that German commanders came to expect. First came the artillery, massive, sustained, and impressively accurate. British gunners were among the best in the war, capable of maintaining relentless pressure on German forward positions for hours. The goal was not just destruction, but suppression, to keep German defenders pinned down and disorganized. Then came the armored advance. British tank units usually moved forward in tight, well-controlled formations, supported closely by infantry and engineers. The advance was powerful, but it was rarely reckless, and most importantly, after gaining ground, the British usually paused. They consolidated their gains, they secured their flanks, they brought forward fuel, ammunition, and reserves before pushing further. To many German commanders, this pattern became almost predictable. It created windows of opportunity, moments when British momentum slowed and German mobile reserves could be committed at the decisive point against the British. Experience suggested that patience and timing could still turn the tide of battle. German doctrine relied heavily on mobile defense. One of its key tactics was the backhand blow. The idea was simple and often effective. Instead of committing reserves immediately, German commanders would absorb the initial Allied attack, allow the enemy to advance, wait for the inevitable pause and launch a sudden armored counter-strike against the British. This often worked. A perfect example came during Operation Goodwood in July 1944. When the British launched Operation Goodwood in July 1944, they committed more than 1,000 tanks to the attack, one of the largest armored thrusts of the entire Normandy campaign. The objective was ambitious: smash through the German defenses southeast of Cannes and open the road for a broader Allied breakout. The operation began with overwhelming force. the opening aerial and artillery bombardment was devastating. Waves of bombers and massed guns pounded German forward positions, turning defensive lines into shattered earth and smoking wreckage. For many German units caught in the blast zone, the experience was disorienting and brutal. For a brief moment, a breakthrough seemed not only possible, but likely. British armored columns surged forward across the open ground, pushing through the initial defensive belt. To observers on both sides, it looked like the long-awaited rupture of the German front might finally be underway. But then, the advance began to slow. And then it stopped. Beyond the bomb-scarred front line, German defenses in depth were still intact. Anti-tank gunners, especially those manning the feared 88mm guns, opened fire from concealed positions the bombardment had missed. One by one, British tanks were hit as they advanced across the exposed terrain, the battlefield quickly filled with burning armor. When German panzer units launched their counterattacks, the British offensive lost its momentum entirely. Despite the scale of the assault, the front line shifted only marginally. In just 3 days of heavy fighting, the British lost hundreds of tanks. To German commanders reviewing the battle, the lesson seemed familiar and reassuring. The British were powerful and professional, but still predictable, and predictable enemies in war could be managed. Then the Americans attacked, only days after Operation Goodwood ground to a halt. The Americans struck on a different sector of the Normandy front. On July 25, 1944, they launched Operation Cobra, a breakout offensive designed to rupture the German line and unleash mobile warfare across France. At first glance, the opening phase looked familiar to German observers. There was the massive aerial bombardment. Hundreds of American heavy bombers carpet-bombed the German positions, smashing defensive strongpoints and stunning frontline units. There was the armored breakthrough. U.S. infantry and tank formations pushed forward through the shattered hedgerow defenses, widening the breach in the German front. For experienced German commanders, this sequence fit the pattern they had seen before, but then something unexpected happened. The Americans didn't stop. Once the German line cracked, U.S. armored units surged through the gap and kept moving fast, aggressive, and deep into the German rear. Instead of pausing to reorganize, they accelerated. When General George Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st, exploitation became the central mission. American doctrine emphasized momentum over caution. Tank commanders received clear guidance: bypass strong points, keep advancing, maintain pressure, leave isolated enemy pockets for follow-up forces. The goal was not just to push the Germans back, it was to unhinge their entire defensive system. German commanders, relying on past experience, prepared for the familiar pattern. They held their mobile reserves ready, waiting for the moment when the American spearheads would slow, consolidate, and expose their flanks. They waited for the pause that usually came. It never came. Instead, American armored columns kept racing across France, moving faster than German headquarters could react, and in doing so, they began to unravel the entire German position in Normandy. What truly crippled the German ability to respond in Normandy was not just the Allied ground advance, it was the overwhelming dominance of Allied air power. By the summer of 1944, German troops had given Allied fighter bombers a grim nickname: Jabos, short for jagged bomber. Meaning fighter bomber, the name was spoken with a mix of respect and dread. By mid-1944, Allied aircraft effectively ruled the skies over France. Whenever the weather was clear, the constant drone of engines overhead became a source of tension for German soldiers on the ground. For panzer crews in particular, the danger was ever present. Daylight movement became extremely hazardous. German armored doctrine depended on mobility. The famous backhand blow required panzer reserves to move quickly and strike the flanks of advancing enemy forces at precisely the right moment. Timing and maneuver were everything, but in Normandy, the skies were watching. Columns spotted from the air could be attacked within minutes. Allied fighter bombers, especially American and British ground attack aircraft, roamed the road networks hunting for movement. Once a German column was identified, The strike usually came fast and hard. Rockets slammed into vehicles. Bombs ripped apart road convoys. Low-level strafing runs turned highways into deadly traps. Even when the physical damage was limited, the psychological effect was enormous. German crews became increasingly reluctant to move during daylight hours, often waiting for darkness before attempting repositioning. This hesitation proved costly. The German backhand blow depended on rapid armored movement at the decisive moment, but in Normandy, movement now meant exposure, and exposure, more often than not, meant destruction. Even when German crews successfully knocked out American Shermans, the sense of victory was often short-lived, because the problem rarely stayed solved for long. American armored forces had built an efficient and aggressive recovery system that worked almost as hard as the frontline units themselves. Specialized recovery vehicles and maintenance teams followed closely behind the advancing formations, sometimes moving forward while fighting was still underway. Damaged tanks were quickly located, cables were hooked, and under covering fire, the vehicles were towed back from the battlefield. Once behind the lines, American maintenance crews worked with remarkable speed. Many Shermans that had been disabled in the morning could be repaired, refueled, and returned to combat within a day, sometimes even faster if the damage was minor. The system extended beyond the machines themselves. Crews who lost their tanks were often reassigned new vehicles within hours. Experienced tankers rarely stayed out of action for long, preserving valuable combat knowledge inside American armored units. German panzer forces simply could not match this level of logistical resilience. For them, spare parts were increasingly scarce, recovery vehicles were limited and often vulnerable to Allied air attack. And once the front moved, any damaged German tank left behind usually became a permanent loss. Over time, this imbalance created a deeply demoralizing effect to many German commanders. Fighting the Americans began to feel like battling a hydra from myth. Cut off one head, and two more seemed to take its place. Destroy one Sherman, and more kept coming. In the long run, it was a logistical contest Germany was no longer equipped to win. By August 1944, the German position in Normandy was no longer merely under pressure, it was unraveling. Weeks of relentless Allied attacks had bent the front line to the breaking point. And now the danger of encirclement loomed over the German 7th Army. Allied forces were closing in from multiple directions near the town of Falaise, attempting to trap a large portion of the German field army in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. What began as a difficult withdrawal quickly spiraled into catastrophe. German commanders ordered a desperate retreat through a narrowing escape corridor, but the roads were already choked with vehicles, artillery, and exhausted troops. As daylight revealed the mass movement, Allied air power and artillery went to work with devastating effect. German columns attempting to escape were bombed from above. Strafed repeatedly and shelled without pause, fighter bombers hunted the busy roads, while Allied artillery saturated every known crossing and choke point. The result was chaos. Burning trucks and shattered tanks blocked escape routes, forcing following units to detour into open fields where they became even easier targets. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed along the roads in scenes of near-apocalyptic destruction. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured during the collapse. Units that managed to slip through the narrowing gap often did so without heavy equipment, without cohesion, and without the ability to regroup quickly. What emerged from the pocket were not intact divisions, ready to fight another campaign, but shattered remnants barely capable of organized resistance. In the aftermath of Falaise, the Wehrmacht in France had been decisively broken, and the road into the heart of Western Europe lay open to the advancing Allied armies. After the war, many senior German officers took time to reflect on what had gone wrong in Normandy and across the Western Front. Their memoirs and post-war interrogations revealed a surprisingly consistent assessment of their opponents. They saw a clear distinction. In their view, the British Army was disciplined and methodical, highly professional, but generally cautious in its approach. British offensives were powerful and well-planned, yet they tended to follow patterns that experienced German commanders believed they could anticipate and counter with skillful use of reserves. The Americans, however, left a very different impression. Again and again, German officers described U.S. forces as aggressive, fast-moving, and relentless once a breakthrough had been achieved. They noted that American commanders often accepted risks that British leaders typically avoided, pushing forward even when their flanks appeared exposed. Importantly, most German tank experts did not claim that the Sherman was technically superior to the Panther or Tiger in a one-on-one duel. In terms of armor protection and gun power, German heavy tanks often held the advantage on paper, but what worried German commanders was something far more decisive than individual tank performance. American armored warfare represented a complete system of war. It combined overwhelming industrial production that replaced losses rapidly, constant and responsive air support that disrupted German movement, flexible logistics that kept fuel and ammunition flowing forward, and field commanders willing to exploit opportunities without hesitation. This combination steadily eroded the effectiveness of Germany's traditional strengths in maneuver warfare. Against such depth of resources and operational tempo, German tactical skill alone was no longer enough to restore the situation. By late 1944, many German commanders understood a hard truth in the West. They were no longer fighting for victory, only for time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the armored battles of Normandy, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Rewind for more untold stories from the Second World War. And if there's a battle or commander you want us to cover next, drop it in the comments below. Until next time, keep rewinding history.